Our program today is going to hopefully answer some questions about the FedRAMP process, and we want to keep it interactive, so please feel free to raise your hand. We're going to start in this order. I'm Steve Charles, one of the co-founders of Vimix Group, and I got interested in cloud, so I've been supporting ORAC and am happy to be a part of this conversation today, and will kind of act like the moderator. But Ryan Gilhooly from Vimix and Arrow is also going to help keep the conversation rolling, because he has been spending a lot of time talking to software publishers and also partners about the dual roles that each can play in this process. So he'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we have John Conniff from ORAC, who is the technical side. And there's a lot of technical stuff involved in this process. And then finally, we have Stephen Hallbrook from Shellman. And Stephen is one of the third-party assessing organizations. You know what? The FedRAMP process involves doing everything, getting GSA and everybody to say yes, but then a third-party assessor comes in who hasn't been involved and tests everything, right? 3PAO. And so I would like to start with Stephen. Think of it as beginning with the end in mind, or teaching to the test. So tell us what you see, how it works at the end of the assessment, and then we'll circle back and go through the process. The process, for those of you who are not familiar, is the official FedRAMP process. We have it on the screen there. But again, we're going to start at the end, and then we'll teach to the test. So take it away, Stephen.
Great. Yeah, so like Steve said, we're going to start with the end in mind, and the end really, is that that authorization recommendation, or that ATO. And in order to do so, and to provide some context here, really speaking about the agency-sponsored path and from an application perspective. So in order to do so, getting that initial ATO that's provided by the agency AO, and then from that, you're able to leverage the results of the assessment that we would have performed as the 3PAO for subsequent ATO decisions. And that's really one of the primary differences between FedRAMP and FSMA, is that in the case of FedRAMP, it's assessed once and used many times. So multiple agencies are making ATO decisions off of one single assessment. To get to that authorization process, typically as a SaaS provider, you would leverage a FedRAMP ATO'd IaaS or PaaS and have that agency sponsor be responsible for the 300 plus controls at the moderate level, or leverage a provider that has an on-ramping type environment where you essentially bring them the application and have your agency sponsor, and once that application is stood up, you're really responsible then for patching and upgrades, and not having to be responsible for that full deck of the 300 controls. So with the authorization process, there's really two reviews that occur at the end that are very important. One, again, is that agency AO, where they make the authorization decision based on the results of our assessment. And this is an open book test. All the materials that we work in, the controls, the descriptions, those are all published out at the FedRAMP website. And we provide an authorization recommendation at the end of the assessment that agency AO leverages when making their risk-based decision on whether or not to grant the ATO. And then concurrently with that, you have the FedRAMP PMO that's going to be doing their review as well. And once they're comfortable and you've received your agency ATO, you would then, ideally FedRAMP would be good with it, and then you would show up in the FedRAMP marketplace as FedRAMP authorized. So that's really the authorization process. And then if you get into the full security assessment, again, that's really our role as the 3PAO. Again, at the moderate baseline, there's around 300 controls. There's penetration testing, there's vulnerability scan analysis. And again, keeping in mind that this is an open book test, What I wanted to do is touch a little bit on some of the pitfalls and the challenges. And I like to break it out really into two different buckets. The first is what I'll call the federal mandates. And those are in the FedRAMP Readiness Assessment Report template in Table 4.1. And then the others are more practical, kind of hands-on experience that we've gained in working through this process and this program. And starting with the mandates, the vulnerability management is one area that we really see CSPs struggle with. FedRAMP requires that you remediate findings within 30 days, 90 days, 180 days based on the risk rating. And where we really see this often is around their patching and their scanning. And keeping in mind that FedRAMP requires, from a vulnerability scan perspective, that you perform authenticated scanning at the OS, the database, and the web application layer. Another federal mandate that we see struggle with from time to time is FIPS 140-2 validated encryption. So you're required to use FIPS 140-2 validated encryption algorithms and modules where FedRAMP requires you to have encryption. And where we really see this start to break down is clients that haven't fully addressed this on the front end, and they go into the assessment, and at the end, they're trying to implement for things like data flow and data storage, and having to re-engineer controls, re-implement technologies and things like that to address that issue. And then some of the others, from a federal mandate perspective, multi-factor authentication, DNSSEC, supporting CAC-PIV and federal records management. But then the other bucket, really being, like I said, more the practical kind of hands-on issues that we see clients run into. And I will say it's not getting into the details early. You really need to get into the details early. We encourage our clients to work with an advisor or a third party that's very knowledgeable of FedRAMP and actively working in FedRAMP so that you can ensure that you're getting things right that first time with your SSP, the controls implementations and policies and procedures and things like that. And related to that, from time to time we'll see poor scoping, lack of understanding of the controls. And what that can lead to is kind of a continuous loop where you're implementing controls to address an issue that was identified, and then you're having to implement additional controls or technology because you've introduced some new vulnerabilities, some new issues, and along the way you're having to update your documentation. And then two other that are closely related would really be around communication. We encourage our clients to open the lines of communication with us early. We also like to see them engaging with the FedRAMP PMO early, because there are instances along the way in the assessment where a control or a conversation about a control may come up, and how you've implemented that control, it may fall into a gray area. And if we have those lines of communication open with the PMO, we can reach out to them, and the three of us have a discussion and come to an agreement about what that control needs to look like in order to meet the requirement. And then finally, related to communication, making sure that your compliance teams are synced up with the IT and the internal teams within the organization. We've had clients where a patch will get rolled out or a release rolled out, and it rolls back some of the controls that were implemented in order to meet the FedRAMP requirements. And had compliance been involved in that process, been engaged with IT and the decision makers, it would have helped to prevent that issue. So the common theme with these is really, to shift left, start at the beginning, avoid versus fix as a result of the assessment. And I think that really gets us into the next step here.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's perfect. So now what we're going to do is loop around to the beginning of the process. And the fact is that there's a lot of work to do before you start to engage GSA. GSA's published process assumes a whole lot of things that have been done, that you've thought through, and that you've figured out. And so, Ryan, I was thinking, why don't you just start us off with some of the early stage conversations that you typically have with software companies around, the business case, the reason for doing it, the things that everybody wants to see at the front end, and then we'll move more to the technical with John.
Yeah, absolutely. So It's certainly a cultural kind of long-term decision to go down this path. There's the assessment piece, and then of course there's the ongoing assessments that occur 3, 4, 5 years afterwards. So you certainly need internal buy-in. You need a business case that is very plausible, and you actually need the application, of course, that the market will bear. I think having C-level support is crucial in the process. A lot of course, C-level suites aren't necessarily familiar with federal and all of the complexities from a compliance standpoint. So being clear and concise, bringing that to them, and of course, on the other side of it, the engineering aspects, having your engineering team totally bought in, understanding the technology roadmaps, right? Knowing that they're not going to change in a year. New versions may not come out that would affect the compliance aspects of FedRAMP. So I think that's the first decision is the cultural. And then, of course, having a sponsoring agency and knowing what that sponsoring agency's initiatives are, most importantly. Identifying that authorizing official within the agency and understanding the cost burden that they're going to take on. So it's interesting in a recent kind of ongoing conversation with the government, this entity that was looking to sponsor actually threw out a number and associated with the FedRAMP process. That number was $250,000, right, for one application. So there is a cost associated for the agency from a government perspective. And that was done by internal experts. The key for us was to go back and understand what the CSP takes on from a risk management perspective. And that's everything from continuous monitoring, in this case, project and application management, the whole stack, not just the infrastructure, the SSP reporting. So all of that turned out to actually alleviate a lot of the agency cost. So understanding how to have that conversation and what the CSP takes on is crucial in the process.
Right. So we did add some text to this slide. We're not going to read through this. These slides will be available. But that front end piece of which partner to pick, which CSP to pick, as well as the business case, and also the agency sponsorship. Those are 3 big areas. And I was wondering, from the perspective of partners, actually I'm curious. How many people do we have from the software, the ISV side? And then how many people from partner? ISVs, how many? A few. And then what? More partners here? Yeah, and half of you are not raising your hands, so whatever. but here's the point, right? Obviously, the software company owns the IP, owns the engineering, owns the code. And those people have to be integrally involved in this, no question. But partners are close to the government customers. Those are the sponsors, right? So where you have a strong territory, a strong agency, and someone who can envision buying more as a service, and you also see that the application will be replicated across the agencies, that builds that's the basis for a decent business case. And partners can help with that and then participate in the downstream. So there's a role for everybody here, and I just wanted to make sure we're crystal clear on that point. And so now I'm wondering, let's talk a little more about some of that front end work from the technical perspective. There's so many things to consider. And John, I know you've been through this many times. So why don't you just tell us what all happens at this front end?
Yeah, so thanks. I think I want to just further clarify a little bit of the point about the sponsor first, and then we'll kind of go from that point, because it is that key linchpin that allows an application to go through and get to market, because ultimately it's the government that provides that last ATO that goes ahead and gives you the authorization that FedRAMP then goes and puts on the marketplace for reciprocity to work across the rest of the government. So when we've talked with a lot of groups who are looking to bring an application through, and we start to vet the application and everything else, one of the first things we focus in on is who is the sponsor that you've started to engage on that's a good candidate for this. That becomes a discovery type process for a lot of organizations. Many times people assume that because an organization either uses or has shown interest in the application, that's the same thing as sponsorship. From a government standpoint, they have to marry up two things. They're going to have to marry up the business requirement to actually utilize the application, but then ultimately when we talk sponsorship, that gets turned over to an authorizing official, the person who's accountable to assume risk on behalf of the government. And the authorizing official is the one who you're bringing to them potentially additional workload that is not anything that maybe they're individually utilizing, right? So you got to come across and overcome that barrier to bring them into the fold so that they can actually start utilizing. All of them good people, they want to do well, but they've got that reality of their resources. So you get into how do you overcome that? And you hit on that well initially, right? So the two things they're concerned about is their internal resources and the risk. But the FedRAMP program is designed to shift the burden of costs from the federal government to maintain and support applications from a security basis from the government to the commercial industry. In this case, the CSP, the cloud service provider, that's bringing the application through. So the entire process that Steve talked about, where the assessing and everything occurs, is that evidence that the government then uses it, and they just kind of check the work, and they provide additional clarity of testing they want to see, but they don't have to actually do the testing. They turn it over to an authorized third-party assessor who does it, and then they just review the results. So it speeds up that piece and really reduces that risk. So that starts to account for both time in terms of resources available, and then the actual risk that they're accepting that then the rest of the government will do reciprocity from. Having that crystallized up front goes a long way towards truncating that whole process. If you look on the FedRAMP marketplace, you can look at applications that have been in flight for authorization for easily 1-2+ years, right? And that starts to racket up the costs. It misses their opportunity to go to market with those applications. So you're looking for where are those opportunities where you can truncate that. And having it where you identify the sponsor and you get it up front and you kind of go through that process really puts you in that position. And that's where we're talking the OnRAMP program is where, from an OROC perspective, we take it, we run the application in our authorized infrastructure and platform as a service cloud, and we run it from end to end as a turnkey solution, right? So when we get into talking about all the continuous monitoring requirements, everything associated from integration with the, with the controls, the 325 controls that you mentioned, and where that divides maybe in a group that's using another hyperscaler, where they pick it up from where the hyperscaler left off. In this case, for OnRAMP, it's all under the one umbrella program. And it's really a turnkey solution and allows the application owner to focus on just their application itself, the underlying technology, but the management and sustainment in that environment really becomes an OROC responsibility under that scenario.
Right. And talk a little bit about how the way you've architected the cloud and integrate the infrastructure more with the application is a different kind of barrier between the infrastructure as a service and the software as a service compared to the hyperscalers that then that allow you to actually get through the process faster and then keep it current more easily, provided the software publishers get you current code and you're all working together downstream.
So we get into the question a lot when we talk that piece is where is that delineation, those lines of responsibility, and from the application owner themselves, and then OROC from a managed service perspective, and how does that compare to the other hyperscalers? If you're in a lot of the other models, really, you're talking about putting your application in a hyperscaler where the hyperscaler is responsible for their portion of the infrastructure, and they take that from soup to nuts from that perspective. The application gets deployed on top of that. Everything from that point forward becomes the responsibility of that application going through the FedRAMP process. So when the FedRAMP office has an issue, when there's a monthly resubmission associated with it, when FedRAMP guidance gets clarified as you go down the path, which happens on a regular basis, and that application becomes responsible for maintaining that and supporting that, and they're the belly button that gets pushed. And what we're talking about, what we do at OROC is, since we are the infrastructure as a service provider, we basically extend the umbrella of our controls across the entirety of not only the infrastructure, but all the way through to the end of the SaaS application. And thereby, we already use authorized, tested, and approved applications and methodologies that attain the authorization, and it accelerates that process to get to the market going forward. So when we work with Shulman and Steve's team, we start at already 80% of those 325 controls are already basically accounted for and accepted by FedRAMP, and FedRAMP's agreed to this as well. And then we just start to focus in on that delta of those 20% of the controls that has either a shared responsibility with what we already have in our security plan, or there's something truly unique to the application that gets developed. But starting from basically a baseline of 80% already approved and just focusing on that final 20 really allows to focus and get through that process in an accelerated manner.
And just a quick point there, because it's really important to make the distinction between hosting a software application and the software application itself inheriting those security controls. So the latter is kind of exactly what John's speaking to, and the government is becoming more and more conscious of simply hosting an application versus the application itself being FedRAMPed and gone through that compliance and assessment.
I was thinking, any questions? We've talked about the business case. We've talked about getting ready to do the technical work, the CS, all the real documentation. Any questions at this? Yeah, sure, Bob.
Just wondering, have you guys found, in order to streamline the process, check, if it's better to do a JAB agency approval or a specific agency?
John, you can talk to that.
Yeah, so I can talk and you can jump in because he's got the breadth of it. So to go through the JAB, there's a few barriers to it, right? So first of all, there's a very discrete amount that's going to be allowed to go through on an annual basis. They do 3 or 4 apps at a given time, and they'll run 3 or 4 of those cycles in a calendar year, in essence, right? So in the groups that go through have to demonstrate generally a significant government use case need. So in a lot of the cases, the ones that have, if you look on which ones have gone through the JAB, they have historically been ones that have already been heavily utilized within the government, and you have that existing use case associated with it. And even then, it's competitive as to what goes through. A lot of groups, particularly, for instance, new applications that are coming into the marketplace, new applications that are starting natively from a cloud developed perspective, right? That the government itself is only now gaining into that ground to where they're going to use it. They're difficult to get into the JAB process because of that exact case, right? How does the government prove it needs it when it never has before? But it's something that they want to go through. The idea within FedRAMP is you use the agency sponsor piece, you bring it into the fold as the government starts using reciprocity and they start gaining that use case associated, then it can transition to the JAB at a later time.
Yeah, well said, John. And just to add to that some additional detail, for JAB, like John said, you apply, and then once you're accepted, you then need to go through an additional assessment before the full assessment. So you're required to go through the FedRAMP Readiness Assessment Report, or RAR. And I touched on that a little bit when I was talking earlier about the federal mandates that are in Table 4.1 of that RAR template. So the RAR is about 10% of the overall controls. It's required to be performed by a third-party assessment organization. It gets performed, it gets completed, the PMO does their review, and then you move into the JAB assessment or the full assessment. And the assessment itself, the controls, they're no different than the agency-sponsored path from an assessment and control selection perspective. The difference at the end is that instead of a single agency doing their review, the JAB that's comprised of a few different agencies does their review. So you can end up with an extended timeline, not only at the onset with that additional review up front and the application process like John mentioned, but then after the full assessment, the JAB's review, the JAB's queue, they're going to have packages that are in their queue. that they're reviewing. And
The reason I'd asked it was because some agencies thought that the JAB approval was the gold medal and an agency approval was just a silver medal, that they didn't have equal weight when they should have equal weight.
Yeah, they're viewed the same from a consumption of the service perspective,
But there's
once
a
they receive it,
misconception.
right. Mhm.
I was thinking, John, not all CSPs are architected the same way. You've already pointed out some of the things that you do that's different. And yet there are certain applications are better in certain environments than others. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. That's also part of that front-end assessment that we do before we get into the real details of then what we have to do.
Yeah, and I didn't really elaborate on the front-end assessment piece, and maybe I can use that as an opportunity. So with the OnRAMP process, we go through a vetting, and we understand that the OnRAMP program is being vetted by you guys who are looking to take your application through that process, but we also vet the application to look at is it a good fit for the process? And from our perspective, do we have a high likelihood of success of bringing it through? Because, as one of my friends says, is we don't want to start a test if we know we can't pass, right? And so when we go down that process, we go through from an assessment of how is the application built? Is it multi-tenant? Does it meet like the initial criteria that FedRAMP's going to authorize as a FedRAMP authorized SaaS application? But even after that point, we look at how it's currently integrated. And some are already built, and they're heavily nested within certain hyperscalers, and they're drawing on a lot of the internal services of those hyperscalers, and it may be significant to uproot, right? And to do that perspective. Those may not always be great candidates for it. But applications themselves, like our cloud is built on open source technology, right? And it's designed not to have any type of lock-in from a technological perspective from that going forward from there. So those that are able to be moved in, then it can come over and then it starts to accelerate into that process. One thing I didn't hit on is once groups actually do get into that program, there's a significant documentation approach to the FedRAMP process, and it's a government program. There's certain things that have to get done that is laborious in nature, and it has to be accounted for. That is part of this program, where it takes through the building out of the system security plan. It puts in through all the control measures and the validate and testing and brings it through. So we even have gone through areas where it's kind of a gray area, and we can do certain internal testing to see, will this fit, will it won't fit. Our applications that don't have the 140-2 FIPS validation, are there ways we can mitigate it with how we have the rest of the cloud constructed, since we're able to extend out some of our authorized portions of the cloud in ways another hyperscaler is not willing to do. There's a bit more flexibility there that offers quite a bit of opportunity.
And I also wanted to circle back on one of the things Ryan said, because software gets updated all the time, right? So I don't think we want to be freezing anything. Could you talk a little bit about how working closely with product development, product management on the ISV side to make sure you understand the roadmap so that you can anticipate some of these things and not have people running two different code bases?
Yeah, so that actually is a piece we go through in that vetting process up front as well. We want to understand what that roadmap is, what's that cyclic rate that a vendor comes out with updates, whether they're security type updates or whether they're really truly feature set changing of the environment, a new generation of the application updates. It's important because obviously applications can be updated throughout from a security perspective, because that's what FedRAMP's ideally looking for, that you can kind of continually update it and stay compliant. But it also, from your perspective, you want to stay on the current version so you don't have drift from maybe a commercial offering or where your development cycle's going through. We work collaboratively a lot of times with the 3PAO, with the government sponsor, with the FedRAMP office. When there's areas, they've got criteria for what would trigger a significant change to the assess packet. So when you go through, you get your ATO, they basically have accepted the boundary of risk that the government's aware of. And when you change the underlying application, and if you change the parameters that maybe is a different type of risk exposure, it has to potentially get looked at from a significant change and go through another reassessment on that piece. The idea is you want to limit those because then you bring in other groups and it goes through an assessment, and you can look for opportunity on how to implement that. If it's on like a 9-month type cycle or that, there is an annual renewal anyways that the 3PO must come in and look at, that maybe you time it appropriately with that release. And if not, there's ways that it can be collaboratively done. And a lot of them, if it doesn't change the underlying kind of security framework, even if there's changes to the application, it'll be accepted as is, as long as the continuous monitoring on a monthly basis picks it up. But if you got anything you want to add to that, Steve?
No, you summed it up really well. I mean, as part of the assessment, we're going to look at your change management, your configuration management, and if your changes are in line with your change management process, they won't trigger a significant change request. To John's point, what does is when you start making, let's say, changes to the boundary or things that impact the overall risk posture of the environment, and that's going to trigger a significant change, which is a kind of a laser-focused out-of-band assessment for the controls that are impacted by that change. And what we commonly see with our clients is that they try to line up their significant changes with the annual continuous monitoring, because while FedRAMP does dictate that there's around 97 controls that must be included in the annual continuous monitoring assessment, there's flexibility to layer in additional controls, and we can tailor the assessment to help address those controls that may not be part of that 97 but are impacted by the change that goes beyond change management, configuration management.
So we have encouraged that conversation extremely early. So within the program, engineer to engineer level conversations. And it's kind of stems from a lesson learned, right? Where we had an ATO, we had market demand, we had corporate buy-in, but then when you get to the product development group and engineers, and there's a new generation of product coming out, all of a sudden that delay is 6 months. So then a lot of work that has been done has to restart.
Yeah, I think we definitely have to involve the C-suite in this conversation. And many times federal people aren't really in a position to broker that conversation. But one of the things we want to make sure you understand is that this team has expertise that can talk with product development as well as the business case side, so that you should feel comfortable, or hopefully you will feel comfortable, sponsoring these conversations up your chain to the C-suite for that conversation on both the ISV side as well as the partner side. There are opportunities for partners to own a territory by getting involved early and playing a role in bringing that sponsoring agency's authorizing official in, who, by the way, is typically the CIO. And then, of course, some of these functions are delegated. So it's a high level legal commitment that the sponsoring agency and the authorizing official is making. So that's why all this preliminary work is so important, because we don't want to start unless we know we can be successful. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other things then that are involved in the process as you get into it, once all the lights are green?
So a key question that comes up with a lot of groups, particularly if they're used to run their application, their engineering team, is how much level of involvement is their team after it goes through the process. Excuse me. And really the point of the OnRAMP program is that the ISV in this case delivers the application, the source code, to ORAC to deploy in the cloud. And then ORAC is the one with the administrative rights from that perspective for the deployment and the sustainment within that environment. Now, when the scanning comes back and there's vulnerabilities or anything else that is discovered that need to be updated, ORAC then communicates that back to the ISV, who then goes through their process and delivers the update and the patch. But ORAC is the one, from that perspective, held accountable from their POAM back to the government. But that's how that model actually works. In the tiering process, really from a support perspective, the OROC's engineering bench going through the knock initially and the SOC from the security aspect sustains the environment, and the engineers actually are the ones that are the up-channel tiered support. And only then do we reach out to the original ISV for, let's say, when it needs to go back for the additional type ticketing support that's beyond the skill sets of the OROC team that gets trained on how to run the application. But the OROC people are the ones that actually execute the tasks internally.
So I went back to the original FedRAMP process, because if we've done all our front-end work, we've already addressed some of the things that GSA wants to see us address, which is the partnership. That's that first phase there. What do they call it? Partnership establishment. It has to do with, as a software, as an ISV, are you picking the right CSP for this product? And are we getting the right agency sponsorship? And so if we can have all that done before we roll into GSA, we go to the top of the stack. You don't want to be asking them for advice. You want to know exactly how this rolls and be there and be ready to roll. So that's one of the first things. And then as we move into the next phase here, the full security assessment. So this SSP, talk a little bit about what's included in that and what's involved and how that gets put together, because that's the documentation, and I've heard it's like 1,000 pages and whatever.
Yeah, the SSP is a fun beast. And so, I don't know, I mean, just for me, I have a hard time opening it up on my computer without locking up my computer on a regular basis, because it's a Word document embedded with all kinds of things, and it creates havoc on your system just to kind of get it up and running. But it does. It runs across the breadth of the control families with all the controls and the enhancements and everything associated. It runs about 600 pages long, right? And it has all the individual pieces. And then it has 13 additional attachments, each of varying length. So the quote-unquote package that goes in initially is rather significant. And then since it's currently, as it's constructed, built in just a pure Microsoft Word-type document, maintaining it is a very laborious action. So, as Steve is my assessor, he keeps like a running tab on findings for PL2 findings, which and they do for everybody and everything. And it's to catch the adjustments that you have to do, because it's a manual process forevermore. That is the responsibility that OROC does. And when we talk about where we are allowed to inherit 80% of the controls, what it actually shows in the SSP that we write for the application is the places where it inherits. It points back to our core SSP, and then we maintain those things in tandem going forward. And that's kind of a repeatable process that kind of goes forward.
Now, one of the things, we have a few minutes left. Yeah, go ahead.
So we're in the business of making money. In that process over there, can you show me when does my application show up on the FedRAMP marketplace and when I can start selling it to potential government agencies?
And so the kickoff to the far left is actually when you will, a successful kickoff is coming out of that is when you will actually populate the marketplaces in process, right? In a lot of cases, that gives legitimacy to allow the initiation of sales to occur within the federal government from that perspective. A lot of times caveat it with, you must get full authorization by X date, right, or X amount of time. But then you actually become authorized, where if you look under section 3 there, that's on the slide, once you hit agency ATO, the agency himself is authorized to use you within that environment to the extent that their ATO authorizes. But that next blue square over there is when FedRAMP kind of reviews that package, does their own self-assess or their own assessment of the application afterwards. When that one's completed is when they flip it over to authorization.
So can they use it while it's going through the authorization process? Can they use the
The actual agency that's going through the sponsorship can. And they can put it in there, and they can issue, because in that particular case, they're accepting the risk. And they're intimate within the details associated with it. And it's actually something we encourage, too, from that perspective. because when they start using it, any concerns that they have while you're going through that process becomes really a task that he checks to make sure we did. And that way, when we go back through and we finish that process, it's like the government can sit there and say, we use our application in this manner, and we want to know particular security features to match the way that we utilize it. And we had somebody independent that's been certified by the government that checked it, and is going to keep checking it and going forward.
Is that what you call FedRAMP ready?
No, FedRAMP Ready actually is when you go through without a sponsor. So it's when you go through and you demonstrate on the mandates that you meet the controls, but you haven't had that tailorization yet from a sponsor.
You guys mentioned JAB. This is the first time I hear that. What is the distinction within FedRAMP, which is the government, and what is JAB, and what is it? That's the first time I hear about it.
Yeah, so
So ignore my.
No, that's fine.
It's a good question. So it's really one of the two primary paths. So there's the agency-sponsored path that we've been speaking to throughout this segment. And then JAB is really a collective group of CIOs or representatives from different agencies within the government. So they actually do the review. So you have multiple sets of eyes on the package, whereas with the agency-sponsored path, it's just your sponsoring agency that's doing the review.
My sense of it is that this joint advisory board, it's DOD, GSA, I'm not sure, it's
DHS.
You know, they want to know that this is something hot that's gonna, like, everybody needs now, or is already installed and we need to get it done. That's the kind of thing they want to take on. So if your product is kind of newer, or its deployment is a little spotty, you probably want to do the agency. That's just my impression, because they only take like 3 or 4 a quarter.
Right.
And they're only committing to about a dozen a year. So that doesn't really scale. Yeah. Yeah,
So
Michael.
if, as a ISV, I've already gone down this path, or tried to go down this path with FedRAMP, but now I hear about OnRAMP. How do I work with MX and OROC to leverage the investment I've already put in and try to not have to redo stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. So we could engage depending on how far along you are, right? And that can mean a lot of different things. Are you, already engaged with another CSP? Have you created a relationship with a 3PAO? Has there been assessment work done? So that's something that we could talk about and determine where you are in the process. But just because you've started the process doesn't mean that that work will go lost. You could enter OnRAMP and repurpose the work and finish the process quicker for less cost.
Yeah, it can serve as an accelerant for sure. We talked about a lot of that documentation. The assumption is that if you've gone down that path to that point, you have a certain amount of that documentation built out.
Yeah.
And you've kind of got the design and how you want it to approach meeting the controls and the ability then to deploy it. And then that can certainly serve as an accelerant through the process.
Another question?
Do you have any comments if the application maybe is only being used on-prem and hasn't been put in the cloud yet? How does that change the approach, or any suggestions you can give there?
So that gets into more of the engineering discussion that we do with the questionnaire. The questionnaire initially is like, we've been working through this one over time, but it's down to about 1 page. And it's designed to kind of get into the framework of the specifics of how the application is deployed and understanding kind of the architectural diagram of it. There are ways that applications that have been historically kind of like an on-prem style deployment, that then you can still take it, deploy it in the cloud, put it in a multi-tenant style fashion of some capability and still deliver it that way without really any re-engineering of the original application. And that's something that has been seen frequently, because a lot of groups, look, they're going to go through the FedRAMP process. They already have all these different terms and acronyms and everything else being thrown at them. The concern is how much re-engineering is going to have to be done on their bench to deliver their product that they're historically set up to deliver. In a lot of cases, you can keep that natively as is. You just have to look at how do you put it in an ecosystem that allows it to be delivered in a way that government can consume safely and repetitively.
So we would like to continue this conversation with whomever over drinks. we have to go. So we'll be at the MX Group tables as well as the OROC table. Let's thank our panelists. Thank you, too.